the horrifying fate of kamikaze pilots who survived. Imagine being trained for a mission from which return was never expected, and surviving anyway. In the final years of World War II, Imperial Japan embraced one of the most extreme military doctrines in modern history, the deliberate sacrifice of its own pilots as weapons of war. These airmen were taught that dying for the emperor was the highest form of loyalty. But history rarely follows ideology cleanly. A significant number of these pilots came back alive. Their return did not bring relief. It brought silence, suspicion, and condemnation. Today's documentary examines a rarely discussed aftermath of Japan's wartime strategy, the social, political, and psychological fate of those kamikaze pilots who did not die as intended. Their stories expose the limits of propaganda, the consequences of militarized honor culture, and the human cost of a state that demanded death but had no place for survival. This is not a story of heroes or villains. It is a story of systems, pressure, and what happens when individuals outlive an ideology built on sacrifice. The kamikaze program was not simply a military tactic. It was a political instrument. It served to reinforce obedience, suppress dissent, and transform desperation into perceived virtue. Official rhetoric framed these missions as voluntary acts of supreme patriotism, but the environment in which volunteering occurred was shaped by coercion, social pressure, and fear. Young pilots, many with minimal training, understood that refusal would mark them, and often their families, as disloyal to the nation. The strategic logic behind the kamikaze rested on a profound miscalculation. Japanese leaders believed that if Allied losses became severe enough, public opinion in the United States would force a negotiated settlement. This assumption ignored the scale of American industrial output and the political resolve already forged by years of global conflict. It also underestimated the Allies' ability to adapt tactically and technologically to new threats. In practice, the majority of kamikaze missions failed to achieve their intended results. The Pacific theater was vast, navigation was imprecise, and intelligence on enemy fleet movements was often outdated by the time pilots reached open water. Mechanical failures were common. Fuel shortages limited range. Many pilots never encountered a suitable target at all. Some turned back after hours of flying over empty ocean. Others were forced to land on distant islands or return to base under orders to try again. This is where the mythology surrounding the kamikaze breaks down. Survival, within the logic of the program, was a contradiction. A pilot who returned alive embodied failure, not only of the mission, but of the ideology that demanded death as proof of loyalty. Within units, returning pilots were often met with suspicion. Officers questioned their resolve. Fellow servicemen avoided them. In some cases, repeated returns resulted in reassignment, punishment, or quiet removal from service. Training conditions deteriorated rapidly as Japan's resources collapsed. Experienced pilots had already been lost earlier in the war. Their replacements were younger and less prepared, rushed through abbreviated programs that emphasized obedience over skill. Discipline became increasingly brutal. Physical punishment was normalized. Ideological indoctrination intensified. The objective was not to create effective aviators, but compliant ones. Despite the public image of unanimous zeal, private doubts existed. Diaries and post-war testimonies reveal pilots who feared death, questioned the purpose of the war, or resented the leadership that demanded sacrifice while remaining far from the battlefield. Yet these doubts were rarely expressed openly. In a society where honor was collective and shame contagious, silence became a survival mechanism. The Battle of Okinawa marked the climax of the kamikaze campaign. Thousands of aircraft were launched against an Allied fleet of unprecedented size. The psychological effect on Allied sailors was undeniable. Unlike conventional attacks, kamikaze aircraft did not disengage. They continued forward through heavy fire, creating a sense of unpredictability and constant threat. Even so, the overall strategic impact remained limited. Allied forces adapted by deploying radar picket ships, expanding air patrols, and concentrating defensive firepower. Smaller escort vessels absorbed most of the damage. Larger ships, heavily armored and well-defended, proved difficult to disable with single aircraft strikes. When the battle concluded, Japan had lost a significant portion of its remaining air assets, with no realistic path to reversing the war's trajectory. For the pilots who survived Okinawa and earlier operations, the end of the war brought a different kind of reckoning. Japan's surrender dismantled the ideological framework that had defined their expected fate. The emperor renounced his divine status. Militarism was publicly disavowed. The state that had demanded their deaths now sought reconstruction and reintegration into the international order. But social attitudes did not shift overnight. Many surviving kamikaze pilots returned to civilian life carrying a stigma that was rarely acknowledged openly but deeply felt. Some concealed their service records. Others avoided discussing the war entirely. In a post-war society eager to distance itself from its militarist past, their experiences were inconvenient reminders of a collective failure. Psychologically, the burden was heavy. Survivors spoke of enduring guilt toward fallen comrades, confusion over their own survival, and a persistent sense of having failed an expectation imposed upon them by the state. Unlike celebrated veterans, they received no public recognition. Unlike official casualties, they had no sanctioned narrative through which to process their experiences. From a political perspective, the fate of these survivors exposes the internal contradictions of authoritarian nationalism. When loyalty is measured by willingness to die, survival becomes morally suspect. Systems built on absolute sacrifice leave no room for human complexity, doubt, or adaptation. Those who live through such systems often do so at the cost of belonging. In later decades, as Japan re-examined its wartime history, the voices of surviving kamikaze pilots contributed quietly to broader debates about responsibility, obedience, and the limits of state power. Their testimonies challenged simplified narratives of honor by revealing the human consequences of ideological extremism. They demonstrated that the true cost of such policies extends far beyond the battlefield. Ultimately, the story of the kamikaze pilots who returned home is not merely a wartime footnote. It is a case study in how political systems mobilize belief, how societies enforce conformity, and how individuals are left to navigate the aftermath when those systems collapse. Survival, in this context, was not victory. It was an unresolved question that followed these men for the rest of their lives. The story of the kamikaze pilots who returned home challenges simplified narratives of honor and sacrifice. It reveals what happens after ideology collapses, when individuals must live with decisions shaped by pressure, fear, and expectation. These men were not symbols. They were human beings caught inside a political system that demanded everything and offered no alternative. Their survival did not fit the story Japan wanted to tell during the war, nor the story it preferred afterward. Understanding their fate matters, not to assign blame, but to recognize how states mobilize belief, how societies enforce conformity, and how easily human lives become expendable under extreme nationalism. History is not only written by those who die for causes, but also by those who survive them, carrying truths that ideology cannot erase. Thank you for watching.